Okay, in this lecture, we're going to be talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis, which took place in October of 1962. So, on October 16th, 1962, a U-2 American spy plane revealed that the Soviets were building missile bases in Cuba, the Soviet Union. Remember that Cuba is 90 miles from the United States. And this is going to bring the United States and the Soviet Union to the brink of nuclear war. So, what led to this is after the Bay of Pigs invasion, it was clear that the United States was aiming to overthrow Castro and his regime. Castro asks the Soviet Union for protection. So, the Soviet Union will send money and nuclear missiles, medium range nuclear missiles, to Cuba. So, the range they had both medium range ballistic missiles and intermediate range missiles. And so basically, if they were launched from Cuba, they could reach various points within the United States. So what happens next? Okay, so you can see on the background of this image a medium range ballistic missile, okay, MRBM, could be launched from Cuba and reach within this radius. An intermediate range ballistic missile could be launched from Cuba and reach all the way to basically the west coast of the US, so within this little circle here. You might have heard the term ICBM, which means intercontinental ballistic missile, which can cross continents. So what happens here is that, I'm going to go back a few slides. What happens here is that Kennedy is presented with some options. So what is he going to do to this direct threat to the United States? So he assembles his top advisors in a series of secret meetings, and they outline 4 possible responses. And you will need to know what these possible options are. The first option is engage. This means the option was to engage in negotiations with Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev, and you spell that Khrushchev. Khrushchev was the leader at the time of the Soviet Union. So if they engaged in negotiations with Khrushchev, it would be peaceful, but it would give the Soviets more time to finish building the missile bases. It would also make Kennedy look a little bit hesitant and weak. The second option would be to invade Cuba. And this action would eliminate a missile threat and it would oust Fidel Castro. But it would also kill Soviet soldiers setting up the missiles, and the Soviets would set out to protect Castro and risk an all-out nuclear war. This would also include maybe casualties on the American side. So this one was a little bit more dangerous of an option, and it kind of increased the threat. It increased the threat that they would respond with nuclear action. The third is a blockade of Cuba. And what's significant about blockade is it's seen as an act of war. This action would prevent Soviet ships from making further missile deliveries. And it would, so remember, a blockade is when the US Navy surrounds the island. It would also force Khrushchev to either back off or to take aggressive action against the US warships. But no one really knew how Khrushchev would react if this was the action that they chose. They could also bomb the missile sites. So just looking at where the missile sites were located, they could drop bombs just on those missile sites. They would do this through a series of airstrikes, and they chose not to go with this option because they didn't know if they chose to bomb the missile sites, if the Soviet Union would launch a counterstrike, and where would that be, and what would that look like? Robert Kennedy, who was one of the chief advisors for his brother, John F. Kennedy, didn't like the bombing idea. He thought it seemed too much like Pearl Harbor. So on Monday, October 22nd, 1962, Kennedy went on television and radio to confirm the press reports. And later he went with a Navy quarantine, which is like a smaller version of a blockade, because a blockade is seen as a act of war. They didn't call it a blockade, they called it a quarantine. So they lined up their Navy ships to surround Cuba to prevent the Soviet Union from moving any further missiles in. The world waited at this point. Some Americans waited in this time, huddled in their bomb shelters. And what ended up happening is, as the Soviet ships approached the blockade line, all of a sudden they all just turned around and went back. So after the ships had turned around, Kennedy still had to deal with the missiles that were already in Cuba. And on October 26th, 1962, Khrushchev sent Kennedy a long letter, and in this letter, he pledged to remove the missiles from Cuba if Kennedy promised the United States would end the quarantine and stay out of Cuba. A second letter delivered the next day demanded that the United States move its missiles from Turkey. Okay, if we go all the way back to the United States setting up military bases in Greece and Turkey as part of the Truman Doctrine, the United States also had missiles set up in Turkey, kind of similar situation, that were ready to strike the Soviet Union. So in exchange for the removal of missiles in Cuba, they had to remove the missiles. The United States had to remove their missiles from Turkey. Kennedy publicly accepted the terms of the first note, and he responded to the terms and agreed with the terms of the second note through secret negotiations, and eventually he did meet those demands. What's significant about the Cuban Missile Crisis is that it brought the world closer than ever before to nuclear war. So now we're looking at some of the effects. The Cuban Missile Crisis led to a lot of different efforts to reduce the risk of nuclear war. Kennedy and Khrushchev established what was known as a hotline between the two nations that allowed the Soviet and American leaders to communicate quickly in the event of a crisis. So basically a telephone line directly from one office to the other. And also in the summer of 1963, the United States, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain signed the first nuclear treaty since the development of the atomic bomb. And this is called the Nuclear or the Limited Test Ban Treaty. And this banned nuclear testing above the ground. And in doing so, they sought to eliminate the radioactive fallout, like radiation, that threatens to contaminate human life, animal life, and plant life. And lastly, the last effect of the Cuban Missile Crisis is Kennedy emerges as a hero. He had stood up to the Soviet Union. He showed the United States that he couldn't be pushed around, and his reputation and the reputation of the Democratic Party improved just in time for the midterm congressional elections that were about a week away. Okay, our last topic also deals with foreign policy. And we're going to talk a little bit about the Alliance for Progress. So the United States and the Soviet Union, they competed not only by building up their military forces, but also by seeking allies in developing countries of Latin America, Asia, and Africa. Many of these countries were terribly poor, and communist revolutionary movements in some of these countries were gaining support by promising people a better future. So to counter these revolutionary movements, Kennedy tried to promote what he called a peaceful revolution. And that is to help build stable governments that met the needs of their citizens and that were allied with the democratic countries of the West. So 2 months after Kennedy takes office, Kennedy called on all the people of the Western Hemisphere to join in what he called the Alliance for Progress, or Alianza para Progreso. It was a huge effort to satisfy the basic needs of the people in North, Central, and South America, satisfied their needs for homes, work, land, health, and schools. Basically, it was like the Marshall Plan, but it was for Latin America. And the goal, they gave $20 billion over the course of 10 years. There was some progress made. But by 1970, it's really kind of considered a failure. And the reason why is that $20 billion is not enough money for an entire hemisphere. That equates for about $10 per Latin American citizen. A lot of Latin American nations were unwilling to implement some reforms that were very much needed. And Kennedy dies, and this was like his pet project. He was really passionate about it. And when he dies, his successors don't really carry on the legacy, and it kind of becomes defunded. So basically, they fuel a lot of money in, and then it kind of just stops. They don't continue funding it. And eventually, they will have more unstable governments come to power over the next few decades in Latin America.